Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Cade and I am one of the instructors for CEP 843. Today I'm going to talk to you about teaching students with autism using principles of applied behavior analysis. This lecture will cover information from the Autism Spectrum Disorders textbook, the one on foundations, characters, and effective strategies, chapter 6. Here's just a brief overview of what we're going to discuss today. The topics will be definitions of ABA, principles of behavior, using ABA to teach new skills and to address challenging behaviors. I will go over each of these in more depth on the next slides. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the definition of ABA. Now, sometimes when we talk about ABA, I feel like we almost refer to it as a sort of buzzword, but I'm not really sure people understand exactly what it means. Sometimes you hear people talk about ABA and they think of it as meaning discrete trial training and that's it. Or others think of it as something you use for dog training but not for people. So here's one definition of ABA from the textbook. I have seen others, but they all basically mean the same thing. It describes applied behavior analysis as the utilization of the basic principles of learning and motivation to address socially important problems. So basically, ABA uses basic behavioral principles to improve socially significant behaviors and identifies possible environmental variables that are controlling the behavior, such as the antecedent or consequence. So we can break down each part of the word applied behavior analysis to get a better understanding of what it means. The word applied refers to addressing socially significant behaviors, meaning behaviors that enhance and improve people's lives. Examples of socially significant behaviors include social skills, language, daily living skills, self-care, vocational or leisure skills, and many more. Behavior, although it seems obvious to include and to talk about, it's an important aspect of the term ABA. It refers to the fact that behavior analysts conduct studies of behavior, not studies about behavior. So, for example, if you want to evaluate how often a student initiates or responds to peers, you would directly observe and measure the behavior rather than simply using information gathered from interviews or questionnaires to decide the effects of how well a student interacts with others. So in ABA, we actually directly measure the behavior. That's an important part of it. And then analytic refers to the behavior analyst demonstrating a functional relation between the dependent measure, or the behavior, and the manipulated events, such as a specific intervention. So you want to demonstrate that there's a functional relation between the dependent measure and the independent variable. Another way to describe analytic is that you're evaluating the effects of the intervention. So you want to make sure that whatever intervention you have put in place, that it is what is responsible for the change in behavior and not something else. Many of you should be familiar with the principles of behavior, at least on some basic level. So there are three main principles of behavior that we're going to talk about. The first one being that all behavior is learned. Behaviors may be learned through association learning, which is also called classical conditioning and respondent conditioning. This is most often demonstrated or thought of as the Pavlov's dog experiment, and it refers to behavior that is elicited by antecedent stimuli. Respondent conditioning, or classical conditioning, is a stimulus-response relation, or a reflex. So when your eyes blink or water to remove dust in your eyes, that's an example of respondent conditioning. Or maybe there's some sort of irritation in your throat, so you cough. So these are some basic examples of reflexes that we all have in terms of classical conditioning, but they can also be taught, such as in the experiment with Pavlov's dog. Behavior is also learned through operant conditioning, which is behavior whose future frequency is determined by its history of consequences. So operant behavior is different from respondent behavior because operant behavior is selected, shaped, and maintained by its consequences that have followed it in the past, whereas respondent behavior is elicited by antecedent events. Examples of operant behavior include talking, walking, playing the piano, riding a bike. Essentially, most types of human behavior are considered operant behavior. Another principle of behavior is that all behavior serves a purpose and has a function. So the function can vary from person to person and can vary for each behavior. For example, speaking out of turn in class may function as access to attention for some students and may function as escape for others. That's why it's important to look at the specific antecedents and consequences to determine the function for each individual. The four main functions of behavior include escape or avoidance, attention, access to tangibles or preferred activity, and sensory. The last principle of behavior is that behavior is contextual. This means that behavior is influenced by events in the environment, and certain events can trigger certain behavior. So the sound of a drill at a dentist might be a trigger for sweating and increased heart rate, for example. Behavior is often influenced by antecedent events within an environment, so a certain behavior, such as eloping or running away, may happen in math class because of the presence of the math teacher, who the student dislikes, but eloping may not occur in language arts class. This slide simply identifies different strategies based on ABA that are used to teach new skills, and we're going to talk about each of these in more depth on the following slides. Discrete trial training, or DTT, is used in a one-on-one setting and can be used to teach a variety of skills and behaviors such as communication, functional skills, and verbal behavior. DTT is good for skills that are best taught in small, repeated steps, do not require group interaction, and have a clear, correct procedure or instruction. DTT is used to teach new skills through the three-term contingency, also known as the antecedent behavior consequence. In the example provided on this slide, the antecedent is the instructor stating, "Say car." The behavior is the child saying the word car, and the consequence is that the child is given an actual car to hold. The car is only considered a reinforcer if it increases the frequency of the child saying car after he is told to say car in the future. So if you give him a car and then the next time you go to do the trial and the student doesn't say car, then actually having the car isn't considered a reinforcer, because reinforcers by definition increase the future frequency of a behavior. There are 7 steps to correctly implement discrete trial training. So discrete trial training can actually be quite challenging to implement at first because all these steps often happen in such a short span of time. But just keep in mind that procedures get easier as you get more proficient and more experienced in running trials. So the first step is to have all of the materials ready for the whole DTT session. So if you're going to work on matching skills, make sure you know which cards you're going to use for all of the trials so that you don't have to fumble around trying to find the next set of cards in between trials. The second step is to gain the child's attention. You want to be sure the child is attending before you begin because it increases the likelihood that the child will respond. You can gain the child's attention by saying the child's name, or sometimes if you show them the potential reinforcer and put it in front of their eyes and have them look at you, that can be another way to gain their attention. The third step is to present the discriminative stimulus. This is usually some sort of verbal instruction, such as saying, "Do this," "match," or "clap your hands." Those are just examples. You then provide a prompt only if necessary. If you are doing DTT, then you should have specific prompting procedures and criteria in place. You then either provide reinforcement for a correct response, such as social praise, edibles, or access to tangibles, or you use error correction procedures for an incorrect response, which we'll talk more about error correction procedures in a later slide. Lastly, you want to collect data on each trial by recording instances of independent, prompted, or incorrect responses. There should usually only be 3 to 5 seconds in between trials, which will really barely be just enough time for you to record the data and set up the next trial, but DTT is meant to move quickly. I touched on a lot of these ideas in the last slide, so I'm not going to go over each of them in more depth, but these are just some important things to keep in mind when you're using DTT. So one thing you want to keep in mind is to make sure you gain instructional control prior to beginning the trial. You want to keep the A, B, and C separate from each other. You don't want them to overlap, otherwise you might confuse the child. You want to provide reinforcement immediately. You want to clear the field when possible between trials. So if you have like a bunch of materials out, you want to make sure you move those away before setting up for the next trial. You want to keep the inter-trial interval short, so that is right after the student performs the response or doesn't. It's that time between the end of one trial and the beginning of another. You want to keep that really short. Like I said, a lot of times 3 to 5 seconds is really what you're aiming for. If the child makes a mistake, you want to begin the trial again, and you want to use error correction procedures in DTT. So one thing that I do think is really important is to provide the reinforcement immediately. If you don't provide immediate reinforcement, you might accidentally reinforce a different behavior, a behavior that might have occurred in between the time when you provided reinforcement. Okay, so airless learning is sometimes used in DTT, but I would say it's not always used in DTT. You might go to different ABA centers and find that some centers prefer an airless learning approach, where others sometimes prefer a more trial and error approach. So what airless learning is it's a way to try and ensure that a learner always achieves success or performs the response accurately the first time. So this technique uses a most to least prompt fading procedure to support learning, but the problem with it is that it can create prompt dependency, where a learner will only perform the behavior when prompted. So that is why sometimes some people prefer an airless, or that's why sometimes people prefer a trial and error approach rather than an airless learning approach. So it's going to kind of depend on the student and the behaviors that you are trying to teach. So there are a variety of prompts that can be used, and the type of prompt you choose will depend on the skill you are teaching and the learner you are working with. A prompt is additional help that is provided to a student to make sure each learning attempt is successful. I would say that we do have a tendency to over-prompt students, so that's why a lot of times it's important to understand the hierarchy of prompts and the different types of prompts that can be provided. So the first type of prompt is a stimulus prompt, and they are typically considered a less invasive type of prompt. An example of a stimulus prompt would be if you want the student to read color words. So when he sees the word red, the word itself is printed in red ink. That would be a stimulus prompt. And the color red is slowly faded from the word, so eventually that the word red is printed in black. So you could do the same for purple. You'd start by printing the word in purple and then slowly fade that to black. Another type of stimulus prompt would be if you want the child to set a table, you may put a placemat down that has outlines for where everything goes. So there's a dark circle outline for where the plate goes, and it shows where the fork and the knife and everything goes. And then you slowly fade that prompt. Maybe you make the line thinner, or like the line becomes dashed, and so that there's no longer any lines on the placemat. Another type of prompt is a gestural prompt. So an example of this would be if you asked the student what you do with a cup, and then you hold your hand to your mouth while shaping it like a cup. That would be an example of that type of prompt. A modeled prompt involves you as the instructor, although it doesn't have to be the instructor, but it involves somebody demonstrating how to do the skill before giving the child an opportunity to perform the skill. Another type of prompt is a physical prompt. So I would not necessarily list these two types of prompts as separate. Rather, I would say that a partial prompt is often a less intrusive prompt than a full physical prompt. So the main difference between a partial physical and a full physical is the amount of effort the student has to put in to perform the behavior. So sometimes students think it's based on where you touch the student, such as if you touch the student at the elbow as compared to the wrist, that's going to be the difference between full physical and partial, but that's not true. If you are the one doing most of the work, such as you're doing a hand over hand clap, then that would be considered a full physical prompt. If you just touch the student's hands, like the outside of his hands to get him to clap, then that would be considered a partial physical prompt. So in both examples, you're touching the student's hand, but the difference is the amount of work that the student puts in to perform the behavior. Another type of prompt that is not listed on here is a verbal prompt. These types of prompts are often the hardest prompts to fade, but we use them quite often, especially in schools. So an example of this type of prompt, maybe if you were doing discrete trial, would be if you ask the student where he lives, you might immediately say East Lansing. That would be a verbal prompt. So it's important to always have a plan to fade these prompts. So to fade this prompt, you might say less of the word each time. So instead of saying East Lansing, you might just say East. And then you might just start to say the E sound. So those are examples of types of prompts that we can use with students. So again, there are different strategies you can use to try and prevent prompt dependency. The strategies you choose are going to depend on the specific individual and the behaviors or skills you are trying to teach. So there is a most to least. This would be considered the errorless learning. So you move from a more intrusive, less independent prompt to a lesser intrusive prompt, contingent on students' need for less support. So this would be an example where you start with full physical and then slowly fade to partial physical into hopefully no prompt at all. Then another method is least to most. So moving from a less intrusive, more independent prompt to a more intrusive prompt, contingent on students' need for more support. So maybe you started with a partial physical, student still isn't getting it, then you might move to a full physical. There's also graduated guidance, so this is only the case for physical prompts. So moving from more to less physical support, like I said, used only for physical prompting. And then another way to help prevent prompt dependency is to use time delay. So you insert a short wait between the SD and the prompt. So maybe you tell a student, you say clap your hands, and in the beginning you might provide a prompt right away to have the student clap their hands, and then eventually you might wait 3 seconds before providing a prompt, or wait 5 seconds before providing a prompt. So you give them an opportunity to perform the behavior on your own before providing a prompt. When an error does occur, there are certain error correction procedures you can use to try and prevent errors from happening again. So when a mistake is made, the instructor should clear the field, gain instructional control, and present the SD as in the previous trial. This time, the teacher immediately provides a prompt and reinforces the prompted trial. So say the student made a mistake, you're going to represent the trial and immediately provide a prompt. Then in trial 3, the teacher would then present the trial as they did in trial 1 at the same prompt level. So for example, if in trial 1 you were providing a 3-second delay before using a partial physical prompt, but in trial 2 you provided a partial physical prompt after 0 seconds, you would use the partial physical prompt after a 3-second delay as in trial 1. Another variation for the error correction procedures is to insert easy trials or mastered trials between the prompted trial and then come back to the corrected trial. Discrimination training is used for receptive language training in order to build a foundation for future learning. Now, in the behavior world, we would not normally use a term such as receptive language, since it's not really behavioral. Instead, it might fall into the realm of verbal behavior or be categorized as listener responses. But for discrimination training, you would present 2 or more items or pictures to the student and ask the student to point to or hand you a specific item or picture. So, for example, you might have a picture of a chair, a ball, and a cat, and you tell the student, give me the ball. You then present new pictures on the next trial and ask for a different item. So you would often use DTT procedures in order to teach discrimination training. This says that errorless learning procedures should be done in the beginning, but I'm not so sure that everyone would agree with that. Like I said before, some ABA centers I've worked with are very pro errorless learning approach, while others prefer more of a trial and error approach because they're worried about prompt dependency. However, when teaching a brand new skill, you do often start off using higher levels of prompts so the student is successful and then begin fading those prompts. Shaping is defined as reinforcing successive approximations of the desired behavior. So sometimes when you're first teaching a behavior, the student might not be able to do it 100% accurate or as complete as you want them to do it, but you want to reinforce some aspect of the behavior because maybe they're on the right track. So let's say you're teaching a child to wave and maybe they lack perspective taking skills. So when they see you wave, they wave like sort of to themselves with their hand like facing them instead of facing out. So in the beginning, you might reinforce that as saying that that is a good definition of a wave, and then you'll use prompting techniques and you'll sort of change your schedule of reinforcement in order to slowly make it so that you're only reinforcing when the student waves out. So as it says here, as the response becomes more proficient and or more independent, increased levels of reinforcement may be used. Chaining is a procedure that is used to teach multi-step skills following a task analysis. So in a task analysis, you sort of break down a task into its smaller components. So if the student is learning to wash hands, they might possibly have to roll up their sleeves, they have to turn the water on, they have to pump the soap. So you kind of list out all of those steps. Same with going to the bathroom, putting the dishes away. You can use chaining for any sort of multi-step skill. There's different types of chaining procedures. There's forward chaining. So you begin instructing with the first step in the chain. So in hand washing, you would start with like pushing up the sleeves and turning on the water. In backward chaining, you begin instruction with the last step in the chain. So I guess in hand washing, you'd start with like the drying of your hands. It's going to depend on the skill that you're teaching to know whether to use forward chaining or backward chaining or what makes the most sense. And then there's also total task presentation, so you train each step during each training session trial. So some people prefer this method because a lot of times if you just learn like one or two of the steps at a time, they can become meaningless. So if you sort of train and try to teach the whole step at once and work through the whole procedure, it can sometimes make more sense to the student because you're doing everything for this multi-step skill at once. Another effective strategy that uses principles of ABA is modeling. So modeling is an instructional strategy. It's the process of demonstrating a behavior for a student to imitate. So modeling is sometimes referred to as imitation learning. There are different types of modeling you can do. You can do live modeling, you can do written modeling, visual or audio modeling. And so many of you are probably aware with video modeling or have heard about that. So that would be another type of modeling. So there are pros and cons to each of them. Like one of the benefits of video modeling is that it's going to be presented the same way each time, whereas if you did live modeling, there might be different like audio stimuli that the student might attend to. The person modeling it might do it slightly different each time. So video modeling, you can kind of edit the clip to kind of show exactly what you want. Modeling can be tricky. You have to assess the student because there are certain prerequisite skills included. They have to have an ability to attend to the model, or if you're watching a video, they have to be able to attend to the video screen. Written, they have to be able to attend to the picture or the writing or be able to read. Then they have to be able to recall the behavior to be reproduced. So you might model it for them or show them a video model, and then they have to be given an opportunity to do that and be able to recall the behavior that they need to do. And then obviously they need to have the skills to perform the behavior. So sometimes modeling is effective at teaching that skill, but sometimes they might still have skill deficits and you need to, they don't have the skills to perform the behavior. So you might need to use a different technique to get them to perform the behavior. Verbal behavior is also in the realm of ABA. I think it's sort of outside of the scope of this class. It's important to know that verbal behavior is a technique based on ABA. But I'm not going to go into the different types of verbal behavior. There's echoics, there's mands, there's tacts, there's interverbals. So I know the book touched on them a little bit, but knowing them in any sort of in-depth is a little bit beyond the scope of this class. So just be aware that verbal behavior is related to ABA. And the last thing we're going to talk about is using ABA to address challenging behavior. For those of you who are also in 844, you should be very familiar with this. If you're going to use ABA to address problem behavior, it's really used to identify the function of the behavior. So when you observe, you look at the antecedents, the behavior, and the consequence to figure out the function of the behavior, figure out why the behavior is occurring. Once you figure out the function of the behavior, you use principles of behavior to systematically teach or possibly shape replacement behaviors. So a lot of times, like if the function of the problem behavior is attention, then the intervention you use, the students to somehow gain access to attention, whether it be for peers or adults. That's going to depend on what type of attention the student likes. So to use ABA to address challenging behaviors, you figure out the function of the behavior, and then you want to also come up with an intervention that allows the student to appropriately access that function.